So now we'll go to Sebastián Ceria, founder and president of Funda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to follow the structure of Professor Bockheit, and since everybody knows the mathematicians can do logic but no philosophy, I'm going to talk about data and practical advice. So in my earlier intervention, I spoke about asset owners. Let's understand a little bit what we're talking about here. Most of the money in the world is being invested by asset owners. China Investment Corporation, 941 billion. ADIA, it's calculated 540 billion. The pension fund of the government employees of Japan, 1.5 trillion. The pension fund for Norway, 1.1 billion. What do these numbers tell us? That convincing the asset owners to direct investments to the right places is crucial to solving the investment problem and to making sure that capital flows in the right direction. That's the data, so let's talk about practical advice. I had the opportunity during my career to work with a lot of these asset owners directly in terms of figuring out what their asset allocation models should be. And I'm happy to tell you that at least some of them decided that they should focus a lot of their investment in climate and then make sure that their portfolios are climate aware, which indeed led a lot of the asset managers to create climate sensitive investment vehicles, which led other investors, retail investors and others, to invest in such vehicles. So a positive ecosystem was created by just changing the criteria in which these asset owners directed their investment. What they did was very simple. They said the criterion for making investments should not just be risk and financial return, we should also involve climate concerns or climate parameters in that decision too. So that has created a positive ecosystem for climate. But how about development? I do believe that in the case of development, we can work with SDGs, because SDGs are criteria that take into account a lot of the needs in the developing world. So similarly, if asset owners kept in mind SDGs into how they decide on how they allocate assets, we could get also a positive ecosystem directing flows to where they're needed the most. Now the question is, how do you convince asset owners to do this? I had the opportunity to work with some of them that were convinced that their duty was not just to their pensioners or their countries, but also to the good of humanity, and they decided themselves to do this actively. But there's some asset owners, I can mention, for example, others, like some universities, Harvard University, 50 billion, Columbia University, 15 billion. Do they also direct their assets towards sustainable investing? And the answer is not necessarily. Why? Because they believe that financial return is what they should focus on. That's their duty. That's how they get paid. So when I said before that mathematicians are to blame, I was, of course, being ironic, because at the end of the day, we all know that it's not mathematicians that decide the parameters of these models. It is indeed the decision makers that decide the main criteria that are used for directing these kinds of investment. Now, it is not easy. It is easier to convince asset owners than it would be to convince the private sector to do something for the good of humanity, but it's not completely easy to do so. Sometimes these asset owners will resist. Maybe we should consider a way to be creative. And I have one idea that I will mention in my last 50 seconds. One of the things that happens with asset owners is, because most of them are non-for-profit organizations, is the government gives them a tax break. That is, they do not pay taxes for their financial gains. Their financial gains are tax-free, which means the sovereign is giving the asset owner a transfer of resources from other taxpayers to that particular asset owner. So maybe with taxes, we have an instrument that we can use to convince these asset owners to do the right thing. Maybe what we can say to those asset owners is, if you're willing to invest, not only for the good of your pensioners or for the good of your constituents, but also to the good of the world, you can keep your tax-free status. But if you decide to just focus on your own pensioners, on your own constituents, maybe what we should think is that they should be taxed. And maybe they should not be taxed necessarily like individuals get taxed, but some tax could be applied, because at the end of the day, we cannot afford, sovereigns cannot afford to make these tax-free transfers to them so that they can do what they please. They need to help us solve the problems of the development of the world. Thank you.